Welcome everyone to my 800 subscribers special. In this 800 subscribers special, I want to show you how I program and design my own controls. So we have this thing here that looks a bit like an equalizer interface, where when you select the nodes, then the parameters of those nodes appear. Most of these parameters work very good, like these nice little knobs and stuff, but there are also some invisible parameters which also already work if you look at the values closely while I'm mouse wheeling on them, but they are not visible yet. So this video is going to be how to come up with a nice look for them and how to implement that as well. I would really appreciate if the people who have not subscribed to my channel yet do that, because I just recently read that when I have 1,000 subscribers I can get money for my videos, which would be kind of cool. So the basic idea is that I want to have something that looks a bit like the knobs themselves, with one line that is a little bit less thick than the other one, and a tick, and modulation values that are also shown when the macro value and everything, and when the bias mode is enabled, then we can also change this. It currently doesn't work here for some reason. I don't know why. I have to fix that some other time. Anyway. So in my own code base, making a look and feel works like that you just create a lambda of the onPaint of my custom knob component, and it knows about itself and about the graphics context. So the first thing I always start with is getting the bounds, which I made in resize beforehand. And those are the bounds where I want to draw the actual vertical slider. And I want to get the thickness that is currently the main thickness of the application. Now these are things that are special to my own plugin framework that is on top of Juice. So if you're purely a Juice developer, then you might now think like, what the fuck is that? The reason for the thickness value is the bigger the interface, the more the thickness value is bigger. So small interfaces, not much thickness. Big interfaces, much thickness, so that it scales with different types of sizes. I personally find that to be a very flexible way of thinking about thickness. So that's just my thickness value here. The next thing I want to have is X of the bounds, and now I will let GitHub Copilot figure out the other things that I want to have. Now the next thing that I want to have is the center of everything. Come on, GitHub Copilot, let's go, let's go, let's go. No? Okay, then I will write it myself. And now, let's go. Okay, GitHub Copilot seems to be asleep right now. So I want to draw two lines. Line 0x is center x minus thickness. And line 0y is just y. And line 0y1, actually there are two y's, is bottom. Bottom was not defined yet. Bottom is, of course, bounds get bottom. Now the color I started with is the interactive color, and that means I want to draw something now, which is draw a line. Now I'm making a line with line 0x, line 0y0, line 0x again, and line 0y1, thickness. Oh, of course, this has to be a point. I was a little bit confused here. So now I can build the thing. So now we can see a little bit of a line here, but even though we created a color, the graphics context of course didn't know about it yet. So let's just get it to know about it. Now we want to draw another line as well. So basically left line, and now we will use GitHub Copilot's intelligence to let it draw the right line. Yeah, but we want this to be twice as thick, and therefore we will create a new variable called thick2. It's the same for both lines, so we can reconsider our naming scheme a little bit. Yeah, and now try that. Okay, that looks pretty cool. That already looks like it has a similar style as the knobs. Now we can tidy up this code a little bit. These two things belong together. You can put that somewhere else. so that it looks a bit more tidy. What I like to do is making scopes of things, not because I need a scope, but just so that it becomes more obvious where specific things are happening. I think it just looks nicer. Well, that didn't work because now we have scopes, but that also means, I guess there's also something nice about scopes, that you immediately see which things are sort of global in this context and which are not. And now we actually have two scopes that look pretty similar, and it makes total sense. So next thing we want to do is paint the tick. So in order to get the tick, we have to get something from an array that has these things in it, and we want to have the value. So we will now say values is knob values, and the value of the parameter is values of value. Yeah, I know, but anyway, now this is the value, and we want to know what is the height of the value, which is val height is val times height. And now we want to know what's the position of the value. Val y is bottom minus val height. Thanks GitHub Copilot. So let's just let GitHub Copilot figure out what to do here. So that is the part of the code that's supposed to draw the tick. Let's remove all the other code because it's weird and way too much. Now we have some code and we can test it. Alright, so we have a tick now. I don't like how that looks compared to my nice little tick here. What I actually want to have is something that is aware that the left line is starting here and that the right line is there. And at that point it makes no sense anymore to have all these scopes. Yes, I know. I have to reconsider my code design choice here. And it will now be handled like that. Draw lines. And now we can actually use the information here that we want to start at line 0x and we want to end at line 1x. So this is already more like it, but as you can see on the knobs we have these little gaps that surround the tick, and I did that by drawing the same tick but a little bit bigger but with the background color. So let's also do that here. G set color to color C color ID background color. Now basically the same line but with more thickness. Do I have thick 4 already here? No, thick 4 is thick times 4. Now obviously we want to put the color back, and GitHub Copilot knew that I wanted to do that because it has read my other code of the knob, which is up here. It sees that pattern and thinks, oh yeah, okay, that's what he wants to do. By the way, that brings me to a nice discussion. A lot of times people think that GitHub Copilot just steals code from other code bases, but what it does much more is seeing the pattern in your own code base and tries to make use of that. Now we have a nice little tick in here, and I'm not really sure yet if I like it. It looks a little bit tiny compared to how the tick feels on the knob, but I don't want to go too much into detail now. It looks quite okay, and I can go on with the modulation value now. So now the next step would be max mod depth is values of max mod depth. Yeah, thanks. Paint modulation. In order to find out if we even need to draw modulation, we have to add the modulatable boolean, and well, where added also has meter, to our lambda. And so we can ask here now if modulatable, and only if it's modulatable we even have a max mod depth. Actually, I just noticed why is value y minus thick the case. It's not entirely clear. Let's not use that. Instead, look what it would do if it was just value y and nothing else. Yeah, that looks reasonable. So I think there was a mistake from GitHub Copilot to assume that I want to reduce the thickness of it. Now about the max mod depth, let's quickly debug that so that we can exactly know what kind of values we deal with here. So now when I turn up the modulation to 100%, then I get 1, and if I turn it down, then I get -1, and if I double click for reset default, then I get 0. So we need to make it so that it draws nothing when it's at 0, and when it's at 1, then it draws like the entire height of the line. And of course we can easily do that by saying max mod depth height is max mod depth times height, and mmdy is not going from the bottom. That is a mistake from GitHub Copilot, misunderstanding what a maximum modulation depth is, but we are actually starting from the tick value, so from tick y, from value y, and then subtracting the maximum modulation height from that. By the way, let's get rid of this thing because it's kind of not really needed to put that into another variable. So now we can actually draw this. So draw the line. Oh yeah, we have to change the color actually. Set color to color, and color is going to be colors C, color ID, modulation. Great. So now we are drawing the line. So our starting point is line 0x and val y, and then we go to line 0x again, but mmdy with thickness, so that it's the same as the left line itself. Yeah, let's just check out how that looks. Yeah, so that does exactly what I would expect it to do. That looks pretty good. We can go above or below the last point where it would make sense, which is not very nice, but that's easy to solve. We just have to J-limit this thing between y and bottom, I think. Perfect, now it looks really good. So now we can actually see the maximum modulation depth, but the actual modulation depth is determined by how far we dial in the macro knob. We have to draw another tick now, which looks similar to the tick that we already have. Let's see how I called that. That was not maximum modulation depth, but val mod. Yeah, so now we want to draw val mod. So val mod is above the background lines, but below the tick, just like the maximum modulation depth. So we can do it in the same scope. Const auto val mod is values of val mod. So now let's also debug what val mod gives us. Let's choose a 25% macro, and then we can see going down here also brings us to 0.25, and going up brings us to 0.75 around that point. And if we reset it, then we are on 0.5, which is the center of the parameter, just like the current parameter value. If we go up, then we are at 0.75, and that shows us that this is an absolute value, not relative like the maximum modulation depth, and we can directly use it just the same as we did with the tick. So let's do that. Auto val mod height is val mod times height, and const auto val mod y is J-limit. I don't know if I need to J-limit this thing. Do I? Yeah, I need that. But we're not starting from val y. GitHub Copilot's misunderstanding what a val mod is and thinks it is the same as maximum modulation depth, but it's actually the same as the tick. So bottom minus val mod height. And now we can actually draw the tick with the same method that was used here, I think, except that we don't need the background thing. Now the color doesn't have to be reset, obviously, because we still use the modulation color, val y, not val y, but val mod y. Yeah, that looks about reasonable. Now that makes sense, obviously, but now we have to actually remind the code that color is not mod anymore when we have reached this part of the code. So now this is interact. And I just want this to be consistent throughout the method, that we use color for that kind of stuff and not directly put it into set color. I don't know why, but I just like it. It just represents the color at all times. Okay, so now we have a slider that actually represents the maximum modulation depth as well as the current macro depth, and it looks pretty good at doing that. I wouldn't say that it looks exactly the same style as the knob yet, but it comes pretty close, and that's good. Now if I right click here, then we can see that the bias mode actually works. So for some reason it doesn't. Oh, it works here as well. Then I don't know why it didn't work before. That is kind of weird. Now, as you can see, bias means that I can basically say that there should be some sort of mapping on the way the macro is interpreted. For example, if I put the bias very far to the right, then that means that it very quickly begins to approach the end value, even on the low macro values, while when I turn bias back to the beginning, then I have to turn up macro up until almost the end, until it starts actually going to the end value. That way, I want people to just come up with flexible modulation in my plugins without having to have a remap curve like in Vital, even though I really like the remap curve feature in that synthesizer. But you know, my plugins are not big synthesizers, so I think it's more reasonable to make that a simplified version of that concept. We want to know what would happen. So first of all, we have to remind ourselves what happens on the knob when we use the bias, which is that we are drawing something that starts from the center on the bigger line. So we will do that here too. And it can go to 0 and 1, depending on what you do. And yeah, so theoretically it already works that the bias control changes the tick of the current modulation depth, but it doesn't draw the bias itself yet. So that's something that we will do now. Const auto bias is values of mod bias. Also debugging this because I'm not sure how it is represented at the moment. Okay, so it can be approaching 0 or it can be approaching 1. Something between 0 and 1. Interesting. So that means that we are starting y0 is center y. Bias x is the same as line 1x. Better call that bias y0, and now bias y1 is bias y0 minus the height of the bias. Yeah, let's give that an extra value. Bias height is bias times height, so that it's just a little bit more readable again. Now we're drawing the line. That looks about right, except that we have to use thick 4 because we are on the thicker line, and of course we have to change the color to the color of the bias. Now that should work, I guess. And of course it doesn't. The reason for that is that this thing is mistaken. It has to be from bottom to bias height, and also the thickness seemed wrong to me. Oh yeah, I actually did use thick 2 and not thick 4, so GitHub Copilot got it right. Okay, now I suffer from that bug again where I cannot go in bias mode on these parameters. Now I can for some reason. So that is something that I still have to solve, obviously, but let's just try this now, because that is what we came here for. And we can see it works. And now let's me dial in the bias, and it looks good at doing so. Yep. That looks fine. It looks like we have accomplished this mission. Obviously there is a little bit of something missing here, because we also have the possibility that a knob has a meter, and that is the case, for example, for the in and output knobs. But I cannot demonstrate that now because the current look and feel of these knobs doesn't let the meter come through on this very tiny line between the other two lines. I still have to find a solution for that, and also because the audio input is muted. But I think for now I will just make a little comment: remember to implement has meter. Another thing that's still a little bit weird about this is that the control actually doesn't feel like a dial, but like a knob still, because it's part of my custom knob class. You can see when I'm dragging that, then it drags from relative from where it was before, like a knob, but usually you would expect a slider to go more in absolute values. So where I'm clicking, that's where the value jumps. That's what you would expect from a slider. That's not what's happening here. One thing that does already work like I wanted for a slider is mouse wheel motion, where you can just mouse wheel a little bit and you jump to the next value, which feels very comfy. But that's not something that I will solve in this video, because it's like a topic for itself. And yeah, I think that's enough for today. I hope that you found that useful. I know it's kind of very specific to the way that I work with painting components. Like, you know, I'm not using Juice Look and Feel, but I have my on paint lambda. But you know, you could do something similar if you had now a look and feel context with that typical Juice slider look and feel method. Of course, you would have to find a solution to have something like my values array with the different things like maximum modulation depth and volume mod, but that requires way more things than just a little bit of look and feel. So I cannot cover that in this video, and I can only assume that you already did that and now want to paint the thing. So that's how I do it. That's how I approach things like that. And this one was a particularly easy thing to solve because it didn't have any arcs and stuff like that like knobs do, but just straight lines. And it was surprisingly easy because of that. That's already a pretty long conclusion, but I guess it's my 800 subscribers special. Okay. Goodbye everyone.